If you're new here, you're warmly invited to subscribe to our quiet corner of YouTube. And if you'd like, leave us a soft little comment below. Let us know where and when you're watching from. Perhaps you're listening late at night, or drifting off with the morning light. Or perhaps you clicked by mistake while searching for cat videos. Don't worry, you're safe to stay. Cats have been distracting humans since the Middle Ages anyway. Tonight, we'll be journeying back to the dusty, sun-drenched streets of ancient Babylon. A city whose very name has become synonymous with age-old splendor, golden ziggurats, and biblical mentions. But tonight, we are not climbing monuments or deciphering lost languages. No, tonight, we are doing something more ordinary, more grounded, and perhaps more peaceful. We are walking the streets. Not running, never rushing. We'll observe how people moved on carts, on foot, on animal back. We'll watch how the paths were laid and how society decided who had the right of way. There were no traffic lights, no stop signs, and no neon orange road cones. And yet people found their way. Babylon had its own rhythm, a silent choreography of movement through heat, dust, and human need. And by understanding it, we understand something universal, the gentle ways in which order emerges from seeming chaos, even in a city with no stop signs. So settle in, maybe fluff your pillow, and let's begin our quiet stroll through the ancient city of Babylon. Imagine yourself walking slowly beneath a hot, pale sky. The ground is firm but uneven, sun-baked clay beneath your sandals or your bare feet, if you're of modest means. The air is thick with the scent of sun-warmed dust and cooking fires. Around you, walls rise not of gleaming stone, but of mud brick, sometimes crumbling at the edges, sometimes patched with straw and plaster. Welcome, to Babylon. Not just Babylon the capital, but Babylon the place where people actually lived, where they rose in the morning to feed goats, fetch water, and barter for onions. You're in a city built for life, not legend. The streets were narrow, very narrow, some as tight as your shoulders could allow. Winding alleyways carved between homes, workshops, and tiny courtyards. There was no grand urban plan, no grid of elegant boulevards. Instead, Babylonian cities unfolded organically, like a river delta or the branches of a fig tree, shaped by need and negotiation. At the heart of things, a ziggurat rose in slow, step defiance of the flat landscape, the temple of Marduk in Babylon's case. But for most people, that monumental structure was distant, symbolic. Daily life played out in the lanes and lanes between homes and shops. Streets had names, though not all of them. Some were called things like Street of the Bakers, or the Way of the Gate. Others were simply a path between this house and that one. There were main arteries, to be sure, wide enough for carts pulled by oxen, donkeys, or the occasional group of slaves bearing amphorae. But the bulk of the city? It was intimate, constricting, earth-toned. The homes themselves leaned in, casting shade in the hotter months. Upper stories sometimes jutted slightly over the street below, like two neighbors sharing a quiet secret across a narrow fence. People could almost shake hands from their rooftops. And from above, Babylon would have looked like a great, softly irregular maze, its streets less designed than grown. Not unlike a termite mound or coral reef. Functional, messy, alive. Now, despite this lack of symmetry, there was a kind of order. People knew which way to go, when to yield, and how to weave through one another like threads in a loom. You didn't need signs when your feet knew the way. And of course, the city changed depending on the hour. In the cool of early morning, shadows stretched long across the packed dirt paths. The city stirred slowly low voices, creaking wood, the bray of animals. Merchants rolled open shutters. Potters checked their kilns. And the streets came to life. Then came the heat. A thick, golden heat that drove people indoors. Streets fell quiet. Dust hung suspended. Only those with urgent business or poor ventilation remained outside. And finally, the evening brought movement once again. Children played in the paths, neighbors gossiped, and the traffic of daily life moved in reverse homeward. There was a kind of choreography to it. No horns, no engines, just the soft rhythm of sandals and wheels, hooves and chatter, firelight flickering in doorways. And all this gentle bustle took place without so much as a painted line or a glowing red hand. Remarkable, really. You might think of traffic as a modern nuisance, but in truth, it's always been with us. Wherever people gather, the question arises: who moves first? Who waits? Who yields? In Babylon, the answer was everyone and no one. It depended on status, on situation, on unspoken custom. But somehow they made it work. In the next part, we'll follow the paths more closely. The streets, the junctions, and the narrow veins of movement that kept the clay city breathing. Slowly, softly, always moving. Let us gently turn the corner now. Slowly, softly, without haste. You're standing where two lanes meet, though the word lane is generous. It's more like the space between two long walls of sun-dried brick, interrupted here and there by low wooden doorways or the flutter of a curtain. The air smells faintly of warm clay and cooking lentils. Somewhere not far away, a child coughs. A donkey shuffles its weight with a weary sigh. You are in the veins of the city. Babylon's street system was a puzzle of winding routes. The alleys could twist unpredictably, a result of generations building, rebuilding, adjusting. Homes weren't laid out on modern plots, and there was no surveyor with a compass and chalk. The city grew like ivy around temples, markets, family homes, and small workshops. The result? A walking city. A city where your destination might be 10 minutes as the crow flies, or 30 minutes as the Babylonian walks. The major roads were few, often packed hard by years of cartwheels, hooves, and sandals. Some were lined with gutter stones, an early and rather understated luxury, intended to direct the brief but sudden rainwater out and away. Imagine how grateful you'd be for that small tilt in the stone if caught in one of the seasonal storms that turned clay into slippery paste. And of course, there were side paths, tiny offshoots, shortcuts for those who knew them, spaces barely wide enough for two to pass without touching shoulders. You might call them alleys, but in truth, they were closer to what we might think of as corridors between homes, semi-private, semi-public, and always practical. Some bore smells of dye vats or fermented fish. Others echoed with the tap-tap of weaving or the scrape of a broom. It was not unusual to pass a doorway with a goat peering out, or a mother nursing a child on the threshold, nodding a tired greeting as you passed. But not all routes were equal. Some streets had dot rules, not official ones. Nothing carved in cuneiform above the doorframe, but rules nonetheless. For example, traders might favor certain paths to bring goods from the gate to the market. These would be more worn, perhaps slightly wider, perhaps more open to the sun. Meanwhile, side streets near temples were quieter, reserved for priests and ritual, and near the palace, even quieter still. Those areas had a silence that wasn't so much calm as expected. Best not to linger. Now, the busiest points in the city were often the market's clusters of open space flanked by vendors. Pots of barley, woven mats, fish laid out on reeds. These spaces disrupted the otherwise narrow, enclosed feel of the streets. Here, the city widened. Air flowed. Voices rose and wove together in a soft, constant murmur. But with more space came more movement. Carts, donkeys, people carrying heavy jars balanced on shoulders. The occasional priest moving with purpose. The occasional thief moving more quickly. All had to negotiate the same space. And without signs or arrows, this flow was managed by something far older: custom. people understood how to move. They yielded. Or they didn't. Not everyone was polite, but most were practical. In the rare wider streets, two carts might just pass each other, though carefully. Drivers would call out warnings sharp, but not angry. A kind of dusty etiquette, passed from parent to child, from older brother to younger cousin. There were no horns, but there were raised eyebrows, pointed glares, and the occasional shouted reminder to mind your oxen. Sometimes, a boy would be sent ahead to clear a path, especially if the cart behind him carried something of value, or someone of importance. And people would move aside, not out of law, but out of understanding. Babylon, like all cities, ran on soft rules, and shared space required shared patience. Let's also not forget the beasts of burden oxen, donkeys, and mules, all critical parts of traffic flow, not speedy, but steady, and very much with minds of their own. If an ox decided to stop, it stopped. One can imagine an entire lane of carts waiting as a particularly stubborn ox chewed its cud, unmoved by the urgency of barley delivery. Then there were pedestrians, children, elders, workers, priests, all moving at different speeds, some barefoot, some in simple leather sandals. You could hear them coming, a soft shuffle, perhaps a quiet cough, maybe the clink of pottery. There were no bike lanes, no sidewalks, just the unspoken choreography of proximity and motion. You might wonder how accidents were avoided. Truthfully, they weren't always. There were bumps, disputes, the occasional dropped amphora. But most days, people moved with the rhythm of the city. Not perfectly, but predictably. And that, perhaps, is more useful than perfection. In the narrow confines of these sun-warmed lanes, people knew the art of waiting, of letting others pass, of stepping aside with a muttered comment and a weary nod. There was no stopwatch, no GPS signal, no police directing traffic from a tower. But there was rhythm, flow, and a kind of mutual agreement that life moved best when you didn't try to force it. You might call it the quiet logic of clay. And now, as the sun rises higher and the dust begins to shimmer slightly in the heat, we'll move along too. In the next part, we'll look more closely at how people traveled, what they rode, what they pulled, what they carried. Because traffic, after all, isn't just about roads. It's about what's moving on them. So, take a breath, stretch your toes beneath the blanket, and imagine yourself once more beneath that ancient sky, sharing the street with a cart full of grain, a goat with somewhere to be, and a stranger whose name you'll never know, but whose shoulder you've brushed in passing. Let's continue now, without hurry, without need. The kind of pace that doesn't require a map. Just one foot placed calmly before the other. And speaking of feet, let's begin there. Because while Babylon is remembered for its towering ziggurats and grand gates, it was also a city where most people simply walked. Yes, the primary mode of transportation for the average Babylonian wasn't he pulled by animals or floated on the Euphrates. It was carried, day after day, on well-worn sawless, sandals of leather, sometimes reeds, and for many, nothing at all, just bare feet pressed to warm earth. Walking was not leisurely, not always, but it was constant. To the market, to the temple, to the neighbor with the good barley beer. You walked because that's what people did. And the city, with its twisty paths and sudden courtyards, was made for it. There were few straight lines, few sprints, just steps, dust, and purpose. Now, of course, not everyone walked. Let's consider the more fortunate, or at least, those with the means or obligation to move something heavier than a sack of onions. Enter the cart. Carts in Babylon were practical affairs, usually two-wheeled, sometimes four, made of wood fig, palm, or acacia, and often fitted with wheels that would groan and squeak under strain. Iron was rare and expensive, so the wheel hubs were reinforced with leather or soaked ropes. It wasn't a smooth ride, but it worked. Oxen were the most common draft animals. Slow, sturdy, unimpressed by urgency. An ox didn't race. It plodded with great dignity. Their yokes were wide and wooden, fastened with woven cords or leather, sitting just behind broad, patient shoulders. And where oxen were too slow or perhaps too expensive, donkeys took up the slack. Donkeys were the city's great multitaskers. They carried, pulled, and bore passengers. Stubborn, yes, but reliable, and far more agile in narrow streets. You can picture it now, an early morning scene in Babylon. A cart creaks along a wider road, wheels leaving shallow tracks in the dry earth. It carries clay jars, likely filled with grain or oil. The driver, a man in a short wool tunic, murmurs to his ox, more for routine than direction. A child rides beside him, legs dangling over the edge. Behind them, a merchant on foot struggles with a wrapped bundle, careful not to trip on the uneven stones. And still others pass by, some leading animals, some balancing baskets on their heads. One man pushes a handcart, its wooden wheel wobbling slightly. You could almost hear the steady rhythm of it. Squeak, roll, thunk, squeak, roll, thunk. Now, horses were rare, at least early on. In the second millennium BCE, horses were exotic, often reserved for military use or royalty. If you saw someone atop a horse, it probably meant trouble, or at least taxes. Chariots existed, yes, but they were not for the back streets of Babylon. Too wide, too precious, too symbolic. Chariots were for parades, battles, and kings, not for delivering fish. And speaking of fish, some traffic floated. The Euphrates was a highway of its own. Goods, particularly grain, stone, and luxury items, were shipped on reed boats or wooden barges, sometimes poled upriver, sometimes pulled along canals. But that's a topic we'll wade into later. For now, let's keep our feet on dry land. We should also mention porters, strong-backed individuals hired to carry loads too awkward for carts. Furniture, baskets, even people, especially elders or priests, transported on simple litters for ritual or convenience. The porter's life was hard, but necessary. And their knowledge of the city's winding lanes? Impeccable. Better than any map, if there had been maps. Which, for the record, there mostly weren't. Movement was dictated by function and familiarity. People didn't explore. They traversed. From known place to known place. From home to oven. From temple to tavern. And in a soft irony that repeats through human history, the most impressive architecture, the palaces, the great gates, were seen most often by those not allowed inside. The ox driver, passing the Ishtar gate with its gleaming blue bricks and golden lions, might not pause to admire. He had lentils to deliver. Life moved forward, slowly, softly, without spectacle. So now, close your eyes. Imagine your feet in dust, your hands resting on a worn cart rail, the gentle sway of movement through a city where the tallest buildings weren't always meant for you, and yet the streets belonged to everyone. In the next part, we'll stop walking and start listening, because the soundscape of Babylon, the mix of voices, creaks, and clatter, tells its own story of movement and life. But for now, take a moment and breathe in the quiet momentum of an ancient city on the move. There's something uniquely soothing about the gentle hum of a city that knows itself. No horns, no screeching tires, no blaring music. Just the steady, grounded rhythm of a place where people and animals move side by side, rarely in a hurry. So let's listen now, not with urgency, but with care. Imagine yourself standing in a shaded doorway, perhaps leaning slightly against the cool stone frame. It's early morning in Babylon, a kind of morning where the sun has only just cleared the walls and the street is bathed in a soft amber light. And slowly, as if waking from a long sleep, the city begins to stir. First, a low clatter of pottery. Somewhere nearby, A household is arranging jar setting them out on the doorstep, rinsing them with ladles of water scooped from a clay cistern. A quiet splash, a murmured word, and the shuffle of feet. Bare, sandaled, careful. Children moving toward the well, balancing small vessels. Women greeting each other with nods more than words, conserving energy for the heat that will come later. Their voices are hushed, respectful of the morning's gentleness. A donkey brays, unimpressed by the hour. A rooster crows, not that it's needed. Most people were up before him. Then the creak, the unmistakable sound of a wooden cart's axle turning. The rhythm of that creaking is familiar, predictable, almost musical in its own way. It is joined by the quiet thump of the wheels hitting a worn ridge in the dirt path. The driver says nothing. His oxen know the way. As the morning stretches on, the volume rises, but only just. Babylon did not roar. It murmured. You hear the soft slap of a baker's paddle against the side of an oven. The hiss of steam as hot bread meets cooler air. Somewhere nearby, metal tools tap rhythmically, a smith at work, perhaps shaping a plow blade or repairing a cracked hinge. Voices mingle, buyers, sellers, gossipers, but they don't shout. Babylon's streets were close, echoing chambers. You didn't need to raise your voice. A whisper carried. A laugh echoed longer than it should have. Arguments were rare, or, when they happened, quickly dispersed by the combined disapproval of the neighbors. In the central market, the sound thickens. Animals grunt. Vendors chant the same lines again, and again offers of lentils, dates, barley, salted fish. Someone plays a flute, off-key but earnest. Children laugh, feet slapping the hard-packed earth as they chase each other between stalls. And above it all, always, the slow cadence of daily movement. A wheel turning. A jug set down. A broom sweeping dust back into its rightful place. Sandals brushing against stone. And beneath it always the steady, dry breath of wind as it snakes its way through narrow lanes, carrying scents of earth and oil, cumin and heat. Then, as the sun climbs, the city grows quieter again. A collective retreat into shaded rooms and covered courtyards. Traffic slows. The heat enforces a kind of stillness. It's a hush born of necessity, not design. The streets, so full just an hour before, now lie quiet. A single cart passes, its driver nodding at the shadows. A dog naps in the middle of the path, unmoved. If you listened closely in these moments, you'd hear the occasional crack of cooling bricks, the whisper of fabric swaying in a doorway, the distant call of someone on a rooftop, passing water from one vessel to another. Then, gradually, as the sun lowers, life returns. Not all at once, but steadily. People re-emerge, blinking at the softer light. A girl carries a bowl of dates to a neighbor. A boy trails behind his father, arms full of kindling. The smith begins to hammer again, this time with more purpose. Evening meals require tools, after all. And with this renewed motion, the street begins to hum again, but never frantically. The tempo remains gentle. The soundtrack of the city is one of labor and ritual, repetition and familiarity. Even the animals knew their role. Donkeys stood where they were tied, chewing with patience. Oxen moved only when nudged. Dogs trotted with the sort of weary authority only city dogs possess, the unspoken knowledge of every alley's secret. As darkness fell, the city didn't sleep immediately, but it softened. Fires flickered behind walls. The last carts returned to their courtyards. Water was poured over dusty feet. Bowls were shared, and voices turned inward. There was no electricity, of course. No hum of refrigerators. No streetlights buzzing overhead. Just stars. And the occasional voice, drifting from a rooftop, telling a story that began, as stories always do, with something like, "When I was a boy," and then silence. Real silence. Not the absence of sound, but the fullness of quiet, the kind that settles deep into clay walls and open windows, broken only by the distant ripple of the river or the creak of a shutter in the breeze. That was the soundscape of ancient Babylon. Alive, but never loud. Crowded, but never chaotic. Every shuffle, every whisper, every wheel's groan added to a music not composed, but lived. And so, as we leave this first segment our quiet tour through the physical city, its streets and lanes, its traffic and stillness, we prepare to look more closely at the hidden laws that kept it all moving. Because even in the absence of stop signs, Babylon found its rules. In our next segment, we'll walk beside the laws themselves etched in stone, written in clay guiding oxen, carts, and careless feet, with a clarity that modern road signs can only dream of. But for now, let the rhythm of that ancient city linger your ears. Let it rock you gently toward sleep or stillness. Imagine yourself once again beneath the hazy sky of Mesopotamia. You're in the shadow of a broad archway, watching the soft dust settle in the midday sun. A cart passes, slowly, carefully. The oxen barely disturb the quiet. Now, ask yourself a question. How did everyone know who had the right of way? There was no painted line, no uniformed officials standing at a junction, directing donkeys to stop and merchants to proceed. And yet, it worked. Because somewhere, quietly tucked into the clay records of civilization, the rules had already been written. You see, Babylon wasn't just a city of brick and dust. It was a city of law. This was the land of scribes and tablets, of codes impressed with careful strokes by reed stylus into soft clay. These weren't abstract philosophies. They were practical, pragmatic, deeply concerned with property, commerce, and yes, even traffic. You've likely heard of the Code of Hammurabi. Perhaps you imagined it filled with stern warnings and lofty principles. But in reality, it was rather domestic, grounded, deeply concerned with carts, collisions, neighbors, and livestock that wandered where they shouldn't. Let's begin with the simple idea of responsibility. Babylonian law prized accountability quiet, unmistakable, and occasionally unforgiving. If your ox strayed into a street and damaged someone's goods, you were liable. If a cart driver ran over a child, whether through carelessness or haste, he paid the price. If a wall collapsed into the roadway and crushed a passerby, the builder or the owner was at fault. There was no shrugging, no court of appeals. The law was clear, and it was often severe, though even that severity carried a certain symmetry. The punishment reflected the harm. If your negligence cost someone a life, the law did not ask how you felt about it. It responded with its own quiet certainty. And the most remarkable part? These laws didn't shout. They whispered from clay tablets, tucked in temple archives and legal storerooms. Thousands of them. Small, palm-sized records of who did what to whom and what was owed in return. Let's consider a small scene. A man is guiding his cart through a busy street. His oxen are sluggish, it's hot. He urges them forward, perhaps too firmly. They lurch. The wheel clips a pottery vendor's stand. Jars fall. Clay shatters. A day's earnings vanish in a puff of dust. The vendor protests. The cart driver insists it was the ox's fault. But the law says otherwise. Responsibility in Babylon didn't disappear into excuses. There was no notion of accidents in the modern legal sense. Things happened, yes, but someone was always accountable. The city could not afford disorder, not in its streets, not in its markets, not beneath its low, humming rooftops. In this way, Babylon's traffic rules weren't enforced with whistles or flashing lights. They were enforced with memory, with reputation, with legal tablets carved by hand and read aloud in quiet courtyards. And what about public roads? They were considered shared, sacred even. The king might commission a grand processional route for festival days. The temple priests might patrol paths leading to shrines. But for the average citizen, the street was a delicate commons, a space where behavior was shaped more by shared expectation and by physical enforcement. Walkers yielded to carts. Carts yielded to status. Everyone yielded to the priesthood. And if someone failed to observe that dance, the law remembered. Even the simple act of blocking a road, say, by leaving a broken cart or tying up your animals too long was frowned upon. There are records of people fined for obstructing flow, for turning a shared street into their personal storage space. Babylon didn't tolerate selfishness in motion. There's something oddly comforting in that. Despite the lack of signs or sirens, a city moved not through chaos, but through custom. A soft code of conduct reinforced by an even softer voice, the voice of the law, murmuring through generations. And of course, disputes happened. One cart too many, one loud accusation. A neighbor claiming the alley was theirs. But these disputes were settled, not shouted, with scribes, with tablets. Sometimes with oaths taken beneath the temple's watchful gaze. Imagine two men, dusty and frustrated, standing before a scribe in a quiet chamber. One gesturing angrily about his crushed grain sack, the other clutching the reins of his mule, insisting it was innocent. The scribe listens. He asks a few questions. He consults a previous ruling. He writes slowly. And just like that, the rhythm of the city continues, restored, not by force, but by memory claim memory. So the next time you stand at a stoplight, waiting for it to turn green, consider that somewhere, 3,000 years ago, another person waited too, not for a light, but for a cart to pass. Not because the law told him to stop, but because experience had taught him that waiting meant peace, and peace meant progress. In the next part, we'll look more closely at one of the oldest legal codes in the world, Hammurabi S, and how this king of kings had opinions, not just about palaces and taxes, but about wheels, carts, oxen, and the surprisingly complex etiquette of shared roads. But for now, take a moment. Imagine the quiet justice of a world where laws were heavy, not loud, etched, not spoken, and yet still respected. Imagine a stone steely tall, dark, and slightly curved at the top, etched from top to bottom in small, sharp cuneiform script. At its crown, the god Shamash sits upon a throne, handing the symbols of rule to Hammurabi, the sixth king of Babylon. A divine moment carved into black diorite, and below it, laws. Not declarations of philosophy, not soaring poetry, but detailed entries on livestock disputes, property boundaries, surgical errors, and surprisingly often traffic. Because while Hammurabi is remembered for his grandeur, his law code assembled around 1754 BCI is full of quiet, practical concern for the realities of daily life. And those realities included carts, oxen, roads, and the minor collisions of ancient logistics. Let's start with this. Law 124. It's an elegant one. If a man delivers goods to another for transportation, and the latter loses them, he must compensate the owner. In other words, Babylonian freight insurance. If your jars of oil broke because someone packed them carelessly on a donkey cart, you weren't just out of luck, you had recourse. But it continues. There are more laws narrower in scope, but oddly familiar. Law 125. If a man hires a ferryman to transport grain or oil, and it is spoiled or spilled during transit, the ferryman must make restitution. That's right. Even river traffic was held accountable. Hammurabi, it seems, had a deeply personal interest in the safe and timely movement of goods. And then we have the clauses dealing with carts and draft animals. Consider this one. If a man's ox gores another man's ox, and it is known that the ox was prone to goring, the owner pays restitution. This may sound distant, rural, but in Babylon, where oxen pulled carts through crowded city lanes, this mattered. An aggressive ox wasn't just a danger to livestock, it was a menace to traffic. And the law was clear. If you knew your animal was trouble, and you did nothing, the burden of consequence was yours to bear. There's something both ancient and refreshingly modern in that sentiment. But perhaps the most curious and telling set of rules comes from a broader concept, the idea of negligence. In Hammurabi's code, if a builder erected a house and the house collapsed and killed someone, the builder was responsible. Now, transpose that to city infrastructure, say, a badly built wall that falls into the road, or a water channel left uncovered. If someone was harmed because of a failure to maintain one's property, it wasn't considered misfortune. It was a breach of order. Hammurabi's laws don't say, watch out for danger. They say, don't create it. It's a subtle but profound distinction. There is, too, a legal concern with delay. Lost time had value in Babylonian law. If your goods didn't arrive on time because of preventable delay, the person responsible could be fined. A delayed cart wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a breach of trust, of rhythm. In a city that ran without signs or signals, punctuality mattered all the more. And then, perhaps most endearingly, there are laws dealing with disputes over street space. Yes, street space. While we don't have a preserved tablet that says, no herking, we do have records of neighbors disputing alley usage, carts blocking thoroughfares, or livestock left tied too long in communal spaces. The scribes must have sighed as they pressed wet clay. Another ox, another blockage, another argument over who moved first. The punishments were rarely violent, but often monetary. Pay a fine. Offer compensation. Apologize in barley or labor. The Babylonian system sought balance, not blood, which, given its reputation for harshness, is a comforting contradiction. And throughout it all, Hammurabi himself remains mostly silent. The laws speak for him. They lay out expectations, obligations, consequences. And then they wait calmly for someone to need them. Let's pause for a moment and reflect. Thousands of years ago, in a city without clocks, sidewalks, or steering wheels, someone paused their journey, frustrated by a cart that had taken up too much space. Perhaps they grumbled. Perhaps they made a formal complaint. Perhaps a young scribe rolled his eyes and reached for the right clay tablet. And just like that traffic law, ancient, earnest, unmistakably human. In our next part, we'll look more closely at how social status shaped the flow of traffic. Because in Babylon, as in many places, who you were determined how quickly you moved, and how many people stepped aside when you came by. But for now, rest in the thought that even the great Hammurabi once pondered what happens when one cart crashes into another, and decided that fairness should follow, not fury. Imagine the street before you, a narrow path of pressed earth, flanked by mud brick homes with wooden lintels, gently sloped roofs, and the occasional scrawny goat showing something unwise. Now picture two people approaching from opposite ends. One is a trader middle-aged, sunburned, leading a modest cart pulled by a donkey. Behind him, bundled cloth and jars of preserved fish. He's focused, weary, and hungry. The market is his goal. The other? A temple priest. His robe is cleaner than most. His pace is slow, deliberate. Behind him walks a young acolyte, barefoot and quiet, carrying a bundle of ritual tools oiled, polished, wrapped in linen. They meet at the bend. The donkey hesitates. The trader looks up. The priest does not. He keeps walking. There is no argument, no explanation. The trader shifts aside, gently guiding the cart against a wall, scraping one wheel slightly. A clay jar wobbles, then settles. The priest passes without a word. This is the Babylonian right of way, not posted on signs, not regulated by law, but felt, known, and rarely questioned. You see, the street in Babylon was not just a path for bodies, it was a path for status. And the unspoken rule was clear. Those with higher status moved more freely. They walked in the center. They did not step aside. Others gave way, quietly and without protest. Now, let's not mistake this for chaos. It was orderly precisely because it was understood. Much like the hush in a modern library or the quiet solemnity of a courtroom, Babylonian streets obeyed silent social cues. And those cues began with status. At the top, the priesthood and the palace elite, temple officials walked undisturbed. Their role was both spiritual and administrative. They organized festivals, managed land, coordinated offerings. Their presence in the street was a kind of moving institution. A priest stepping through a market wasn't just one man. He represented a whole system of divine order. And few wished to block the god's emissary on the way to morning prayer. Then came the scribes, the men with tablets. They recorded, calculated, and resolved, not physically imposing, but socially indispensable. A scribe on an errand often carried authority that exceeded his frame. Many were educated, literate, and close to power. People gave way, both out of respect and practical caution. After all, one never knew when a scribe might remember an unpaid debt. Merchants followed especially wealthy ones. Their carts were often larger, better maintained. Their animals better fed. They were not of the priesthood, but they contributed to temple coffers. And wealth in Babylon was its own form of permission. Behind them, artisans and tradespeople, skilled, respected, but generally expected to move aside when the more adorned passed by. At the very base, of course, the laborers, the servants, and the enslaved. Those who bore water, fetched wood, carried bricks from kilns to construction sites. They moved briskly, heads down, weaving between feet and wheels like water flowing around stones. But of course, there were nuances. An old woman known in her neighborhood might walk with more authority than a young scribe from another district. A well-liked brewer could command more space than a petty tax clerk. Social status was not always defined by royal decree. It was also, as always, a matter of familiarity, reputation, and presence. Children had their own code. They darted where they pleased, at least till scolded. Their noise was tolerated, their movement accepted as the fluttering of sparrows in a city of oxen. Only during festivals or sacred processions did even children learn to freeze, to yield to the larger rhythms. Speaking of processions, when the king's men came through, or worse, soldiers, the rules changed entirely. Streets were cleared. People stepped aside, pressed against walls, or waited quietly in doorways. Not out of respect, necessarily, but out of a well-earned understanding of what it meant to not move quickly enough. And this, too, was part of the rhythm. Right-of-way was not enforced with ticket books or blinking signs. It was felt, intuited, reinforced by glance, by silence, by story. A young boy might be told not just, "Don't block the priest," but "Remember what happened to your uncle when he did." Even animals seemed to grasp this order. A donkey belonging to the temple stables was rarely bothered. It smelled different, moved differently, and was sometimes adorned with a tag or cloth that marked it as belonging. Other animals, more anonymous, were prodded aside if they lingered too long in a thoroughfare. So the street, you see, was not equal. It was a stage upon which roles were performed. And walking down, it was not just a matter of direction, but of identity. Yet, there is comfort in this order. As much as it was shaped by hierarchy, it was also deeply practical. Everyone knew their place, not in a cruel or crushing sense, but in a manner that allowed life to move forward with minimal friction. The trader adjusted his pace. The scribe kept to the shade. The priest passed undisturbed, and the boy carrying firewood waited quietly for a moment when the path was clear. No one needed to shout. They knew, and so did the city. In our next part, we'll look at what happened when this gentle order broke down, when accidents happened, when carts collided, or people were trampled, or walls collapsed. because even the most well-choreographed dance can misstep. And in Babylon, as always, the law was ready to intervene with quiet tablets and firm consequences. But for now, rest your thoughts on this small fact, that long before mirrors were attached to cars, long before turn signals or painted lines, people found their way, not just with their feet, but with their understanding. The sun is low. You hear the soft clatter of a wheel hitting an uneven patch of road. A moment later, shouting. Not loud, but sharp. Someone's basket has been overturned. Dates roll into the dust like scattered coins. A child cries out. A donkey clearly startled backs into a doorway and nearly knocks over a jug of water resting on a ledge. It's a small scene, but scenes like this played out often in the city, because wherever there is movement, there is error. Wherever there are carts, jars, animals, and people sharing the same narrow streets, there are moments of friction, literal and otherwise. So how did Babylon handle the minor and not so minor disasters of street life? The answer lies, again, in its clay. The Babylonians were not sentimental about mishaps. They understood that a bustling city would produce broken pots and bruised egos, but they also believed deeply in accountability, not as punishment, as balance. Let us start with a simple accident. Imagine a man pushing a heavily loaded handcart through a winding alley. He misjudges a corner. A jug falls and shatters. If the jug was his, then so be it, a loss he bore alone. But if it belonged to someone else, placed near the wall, perhaps part of a merchant's open display, then things became more complicated. Here, Babylonian custom took over. The man would be expected to pause, not rush away. He might offer restitution on the spot barley, a coin, perhaps even labor. Or they might both go together to a scribe, not a judge in robes, but a recorder of wrongs, with a stylus worn smooth from use. The scribe would ask questions. Who placed the jug? Who caused its fall? Had similar accidents happened before? He would listen, then write. And if compensation was required, it would be agreed upon. Not demanded, agreed. Quietly, and with the kind of solemnity that only someone accustomed to daily jars and daily accidents can manage. Now, what if things were worse? Let's say an ox cart, heavy with grain, came barreling too fast around a corner and struck a pedestrian. Not fatally, thankfully, but enough to leave a leg bruised, perhaps even broken. Here, the law was clear. The driver would be held responsible unless the pedestrian had walked into the path carelessly. Eyewitnesses would be consulted, not dozens of them, likely 3, maybe 4. The baker who saw from his doorway, the boy who had been chasing a dog and witnessed it from the other side of the cart. Their words mattered. If the driver was deemed careless, too fast, inattentive, reckless, he owed compensation. Not as a vague apology, but a specific amount, in grain, in silver, or in hours of labor. If the injury left the victim unable to work, the payment increased. Hammurabi's code includes detailed entries for bodily harm. Loss of a limb, damage to an eye, even the knock of a tooth. Each had its price. To modern ears, it may sound cold, but to the Babylonians, it was clarity. The law couldn't undo an injury, but it could restore the balance of life. A man who could no longer carry grain needed to eat, so someone had to feed him. Simple, practical, calm. There were laws even for falling buildings. If a wall collapsed onto a passerby, and that wall was part of a private home, the homeowner could be charged, especially if they had been warned. If a storm had weakened the structure, and they did nothing, the clay tablets were clear. Negligence has a price. And what if the damage was done by an animal? If a mule broke loose and trampled someone's goods, the owner was liable, but again, context mattered. Was the mule tied properly? Was it known to be unruly? Had the person who was harmed been teasing the animal? Babylonian law, like the best old librarians, was stern but fair. There were even cases of people being trampled during religious processions. Large festivals often brought out statues of gods, carried through the city with ceremony and incense. The crowds could be large, chaotic, and sometimes someone fell. And again, if it was found that a guard had pushed too hard, or a driver had refused to slow, the scribes would quietly take up their stylus and begin their work. One case from a fragmentary tablet tells of a young boy knocked down by a temple ox cart during the New Year procession. He survived, but with an injury to his shoulder. The priest responsible offered not just compensation, but a position for the boy in the temple kitchens once he recovered. Restitution, and then reintegration. A kind of justice that restores rather than excludes. Now, what about those who refused? There were fines, certainly, and public censure. In extreme cases, usually involving repeated offenses or refusal to pay, the offender might be taken before a city governor. Not a dramatic trial, just a small room, a stone bench, and a man with the authority to make the final inscription on the tablet. But most disputes never reached that point. Babylonians, for all their bureaucracy, preferred to settle quietly. The city was too interconnected. Your cousin might marry your neighbor's niece. Your bread might come from the brother of the man whose jug you cracked last week. Harmony was not just polite, it was necessary. So, when accidents happened, they were met with calm procedures. An understanding that order, once disrupted, must be rebalanced, not with anger, but with logic, not with shouting, but with clay. And when the scribe placed the final mark upon the tablet, he would blow gently on the still damp surface, place it on a shelf, and rise. The matter was closed, and life, with its soft clatter and constant motion, resumed. You walk the same path each morning, not because you have to, but because it is smooth, familiar, predictable. Your feet know it even before your eyes do. The cartwheels creak in rhythm. The donkey prefers this way too. But have you ever wondered who built this path? And with what? In Babylon, the street was not just a passageway. It was infrastructure. It had to endure carts, animals, floods, heat, and thousands of steps, day after day. It was built to last, or, at the very least, to be repaired. Let's begin with the material. The most common construction substance in Mesopotamia was mud brick. Humble, yes, but effective. A blend of river clay, straw, and water, shaped by hand or wooden mold, then dried in the sun. Buildings, walls, courtyards, even temple outbuildings all relied on it. But streets demanded more. Their base was often compacted earth, pressed down again and again by foot traffic and cartwheels. Over time, this alone created a hard surface, though one that could quickly degrade in rain. In better maintained areas, wealthier districts, temple surroundings, or major thoroughfares, a top layer of gravel, packed sand, or crushed stone might be added. This wasn't paving in the Roman sense. No elegant stones laid in mosaic, but it was effective. Some fragments of Babylonian streets even show brick paving flat-baked bricks, arranged carefully, with joints filled by bitumen or tamped earth. These were expensive, labor-intensive, but they resisted erosion, particularly during floods or seasonal storms. You could imagine the satisfaction of walking over such a street, the solid echo of sandals on fired clay, the comforting regularity of each brick. A path not just to walk on, but to trust. Now, of course, not every street was so dignified. Smaller alleys, those that wormed their way between homes and courtyards, were often little more than dirt paths. In dry months, they worked just fine. In wet months, they turned to mud. And when the rains came hard, Babylon's famously flat landscape revealed its greatest flaw: poor drainage. That brings us to a very quiet but very important form of urban engineering: gutters and drains. The Babylonians understood the need to manage water. While their irrigation systems are legendary, their urban drainage was more subtle. Some streets had sloped centers, designed to funnel water to the sides. Others had shallow stone-lined channels, running alongside buildings or between walls. In the wealthier zones, one might even see covered drains, ceramic or stone tubes, placed just below the surface, gently guiding water away from doorsteps and down toward the river. The sound of rain in such a street would have been almost musical soft tapping, followed by the murmur of water running through buried channels. A quiet triumph of design over chaos. But of course, no street stays perfect forever. Which brings us to maintenance. Inscriptions from temple accounts and palace records occasionally mention workers tasked with repairing streets. These were not full-time roles, more likely seasonal, or assigned during post-flood recovery. A collapsed drain, a sunken path, a wheel track that had become a trench, and then, always, the humble act of sweeping. Yes, Babylon had street sweepers. Not formally employed, perhaps, but part of temple or neighborhood labor rotations. Their job was simple: to clear debris, smooth earth, and restore order. In wealthier neighborhoods, shopkeepers swept the thresholds. Homeowners sprinkled water outside their doors to settle the dust. Not because they were neat freaks, but because dust in Babylon was a living presence. It coated jars. It crept into bread. It stung the eyes and dried the skin. Taming it, even temporarily, was an act of daily civility. But there were limits. Streets still sank in places. Wheels still carved grooves over time. Stones shifted. Walls collapsed just enough to narrow a path further. And let's not forget the animals. Donkeys did not follow sanitation guidelines. Oxen left their own impressions. Babylonian streets, like modern sidewalks, bore the weight of more than just traffic. They bore waste, which, again, had to be managed. There is evidence, quiet, scattered, that city officials occasionally took note of streets in disrepair. A complaint filed. A priest irritated by a broken flagstone. A cart unable to pass due to pooled water. And when such concerns reached the right ears, repairs were made. Or so the records suggest. Yet the most remarkable thing isn't the materials. It's the continuity. That a city so ancient, so seemingly fragile in its materials, could maintain working streets, not for decades, but centuries, is a quiet marvel. It didn't happen through massive construction crews or dramatic renovations. It happened because everyone did a little. Rebuilt a wall here, smoothed a path there, cleared a drain, sprinkled water on the dust. Babylon survived not because it was immortal, but because its people, cart drivers, children, sweepers, scribes, all took part in the daily restoration of movement. So next time you see a pothole and mutter under your breath, consider this. 3,000 years ago, a Babylonian merchant may have done the same, watching his cart wheel dip into a rut, muttering a phrase so old and dusty it has no translation, but the meaning, universal. In our next part, we'll look at the less charming parts of city infrastructure, the smell, the mess, the goats that wandered where they shouldn't. Because traffic wasn't always elegant, and neither was the road. But for now, pause. Imagine your feet pressing against sun-warmed bricks, the weight of the day ahead, and the comfort of knowing the path, however humble, will carry you where you need to go. The problem with cities, any city, really is that they collect things. They gather people, carts, smells, voices, and always waste. Babylon, for all its greatness, was no different. Beneath the grandeur of its temples and the stern authority of its law codes lay something more humble, more constant, the need to keep the streets passable, clean enough, and more or less free of wandering animals. Let's begin with dust. It seems like such a minor thing. Dust. Just a thin film over stone, a tickle in the throat. But in Babylon, dust was an elemental force. It was in the air, on your bread, in your sandals. It settled on clay tablets before the ink had dried. It wrapped around the city like a quiet second skin. It came from the sun-baked ground, from nearby fields, from the dry riverbanks when the Euphrates shrank just enough to leave its silt behind. It was kicked up by oxen, blown in through open courtyards, and danced in quiet spirals down the long temple staircases. And so, people fought it, not with vacuum cleaners or feather dusters, but with the tools of a patient people. They swept, with bundles of twigs, palm fronds, and braided straw. Doorways were swept daily, thresholds carefully cleared, courtyards watered slightly in the early morning, just enough to tamp the dust down and delay its inevitable return. Streets were sprinkled too, especially before festivals or royal processions. A thin film of water poured along the path, helped keep the dust from rising as sandals and wheels passed over. But of course, dust was only part of the problem. Now, we must talk about drainage. A city built on flat land near a slow-moving river without elevation, without engineered storm drains, is a city that must constantly negotiate with water. And water, as you may know, has its own ideas. Rain in Babylon wasn't constant, but when it came hard. Sudden downpours could turn alleys into slurry pits. Shallow depressions became puddles. Low-lying paths became temporary canals. And if a street wasn't properly sloped, if a gutter was blocked by a stray stone or an uncooperative clump of reed well, it became less a street and more a sticky invitation for stuck carts and splattered robes. That's where the drains came in. Not sewer systems, as we know them, but quiet channels carved stone gutters, clay-lined furrows, and even underground tunnels in wealthier districts that diverted water away from doorsteps and into larger collection channels. These channels often led toward the river or into sunken communal reservoirs where water could be reused or simply left to evaporate. Of course, drains required maintenance, and Babylon had no sanitation department. The responsibility often fell to households. A blocked drain was not merely annoying, it was a source of complaints, disputes, and fines. Records from city officials, inscribed into clay, sometimes document petty arguments. The neighbor failed to clear the channel. My wall was fouled. Compensation was agreed at 5 shekels of barley. Quiet justice for a dirty inconvenience. And now we must address another constant companion in the streets. Not dust, not water, but goats. Yes, goats. While sheep and cattle were often kept outside the city walls, goats were different. They were urban, domestic, independent in the most inconvenient ways. A family might keep 1 or 2 in their courtyard for milk, tied neatly, fed well. But goats are, by nature, skeptics of fences. A bit of loose rope, an open gate, or a toppled basket was all the invitation they needed to explore. And so they wandered. A goat might nibble on market wares, stand stubbornly in the middle of a narrow path, refusing to yield even to the high priest's procession. There are tablets actual, serious legal records, where people demand compensation for goats eating their dates or trampling seedlings in a rooftop garden. One record describes a goat that entered a dye shop and chewed through 3 bundles of purple threaded wool. The owner was livid. The goat, one presumes, was unapologetic. Cattle, too, were a problem when untended. Oxen sometimes became confused and walked into shallow water channels. Donkeys would pause suddenly, refusing to move until someone, usually a red-faced adolescent, came and coaxed them along. But goats had a way of being noticed. They reminded everyone that for all Babylon's majesty, its gates, its temples, its courts, it was still a city of living beings, many of them entirely disinterested in human order. And so the people adapted. Merchants built slightly raised platforms to keep their wares out of the reach of hooves and teeth. Doorways were fitted with low barriers, not for burglars, but for goats. Children were trained to spot and retrieve wandering animals. And on festival days, goats were corralled indoors, lest they cause divine embarrassment during a procession. We could imagine the dry resignation in the eyes of a Babylonian street sweeper, broom in one hand, shooing a goat with the other, muttering something ancient and weary under his breath. Goats may not have followed rules, but the rest of the city did its best to work around them. And in the end, this is what made Babylon function not perfection, but adaptation. The dust always returned. The drains always needed clearing. And the goats, well, they were never far off. But the people swept. They rebuilt. They carried baskets carefully over ruts, waited patiently at the edge of puddles, and stepped aside when the animals refused to move. It wasn't order in the way we might define it today, but it was balance. And it worked. In the next part of our journey, we'll walk through the city's choke points, the crowded bazaars and temple corners where movement slowed, tension rose, and traffic found its most creative solutions. But for now, take a breath. Picture a dusty street, a low wall, a goat atop it, chewing something that should not be chewed. And remember, no matter how ancient the city, some things never change. Some parts of Babylon welcomed movement, wide paths, temple avenues, processional roads so grand that even the gods carved in stone, wheeled through town, had enough space to pass. But other parts did not. There were choke points, not designed but formed, grown, like tree roots splitting a path, created by necessity, by proximity, and by the simple fact that Babylon, like any living city, was never finished. And so today, we enter those places. You can imagine it, even now. A narrow lane leading to the marketplace. High mud brick walls on either side. No sidewalk, just dirt, just movement, just voices. Ahead, the path narrows. A vendor's cart leans slightly into the street, its wheel resting in a groove worn by 100 others. On the opposite side, a storage jar is wedged beside a doorway. Two goats argue, half-heartedly, in the middle of the path. It's mid-morning, and Babylon's streets are filling. And this gentle bottleneck is one of the hundreds that shape the city's flow. Let's begin with bazaars. Markets in Babylon were not cordoned off in tidy zones. They spilled from designated squares into adjacent alleys, from courtyards into walkways. The line between private and public was fluid. Vendors didn't always own stalls. Many simply spread woven mats upon the earth. A stack of onions here, a pile of dates there, barley in open sacks, bread under rough cloths, warm and humming with yeast. And these vendors took up space. Of course they did. They were selling. But in doing so, they turned movement into negotiation. Shoppers weaved through goods, nodded greetings, stepped around a boy chasing a chicken. The space between you and your neighbor became measured in elbows and apologies. And into this came the carts. Grain carts, mostly. Some small, some the size of 2 donkeys in width, laden with jars, textiles, oil. Their drivers called out warnings, though not loudly. A practiced mutter, a ritual phrase. It was not rudeness. It was rhythm. People moved, slowly, or didn't. And when they didn't, well, the cart stopped, waited, or nudged forward, just enough to remind. The city had no signals, but it had dot signals. A raised eyebrow from a merchant. A quiet grumble from a woman balancing pottery on her head. These were the honks and gestures of ancient traffic. Now, not all choke points were markets. Some were temple zones, where wide roads narrowed suddenly into sacred entries. Here, the energy was different, calmer, steepered in ritual. People passed softly. Priests sometimes stood nearby, observing, watching for those who didn't slow down, who didn't remove their shoes, who carried noise into sacred space. Movement here was governed by more than traffic. It was governed by belief. And then, of course, there were gateways. Babylon's city gates were both entrances and filters. The grand Ishtar Gate, gleaming in blue-glazed brick and lions in relief, is the best remembered. But there were others. Simpler ones. Wooden, stone, functional. Gates constricted flow. They were checkpoints, tax stations, military choke points. Everyone passed through them, and that passing took time. A merchant might be asked to list his goods. A farmer might offer a handful of barley in lieu of tax. A priest's litter might glide through uninterrupted, carried by silent boys in white linen. And behind them, a line. Carts, pedestrians, donkeys, always goats. These moments required patience. Not formal queuing, not exactly, but a kind of understood order. You didn't press forward unless you had reason. You waited, watched, moved when the person ahead moved. A slow, sticky crawl that wouldn't be unfamiliar at a modern ferry dock or parking lot exit. Sometimes, in extreme congestion, traffic was rerouted. This meant someone shouted. A boy was sent ahead. People turned around, not happily, but necessarily. There were no alternate routes posted, just experience, passed down like recipes and cautionary tales. And occasionally, people got stuck, literally. Two carts approaching from opposite ends of a narrow lane, neither willing or able to back up. A standoff ensued, each driver gesturing silently to the other. A small crowd formed, leaning against walls, chewing bread, offering unsolicited opinions. Eventually, someone yielded, perhaps with dignity, perhaps with muttered threats. But the city moved on. Because even in bottlenecks, even in moments of shared inconvenience, Babylon preserved its flow. Through negotiation, through familiarity, through sheer, dusty persistence. It's worth noting that no city plan remains perfect forever. Streets shifted as buildings grew. One man added a second story. Another expanded his courtyard slightly into the road. What was once a wide corner became a tight squeeze. Urban drift, we might call it. The slow creep of humanity against the neatness of design. But the Babylonians adjusted. They stepped sideways when they had to. They learned which paths to avoid at midday. They taught their children to duck, to weave, to hold tight to mother's hem when carts passed close. And in this daily movement, constrained, crowded, constantly compromised, they built a kind of grace. Because the mark of a well-functioning city is not the absence of obstacles. It is how gently it moves through them. In the next part, we'll explore the great arteries of Babylon, the city gates, the roads leading out, and how military and ritual movement shaped traffic patterns beyond the reach of the market carts. But for now, close your eyes. Picture the slow ebb and flow of feet on sunlit stone. A boy guiding a goat, a cart waiting for its moment to turn, and a city that, despite every squeeze and shuffle, never stopped moving. Imagine for a moment standing just inside one of Babylon's great city gates. The air feels different here, a touch more open, a bit more tense. You can still hear the calls of vendors behind you, the smell of sesame oil, the murmur of conversation, but beyond the gate, the world is larger, less predictable. You are at the border. Babylon's gates were more than openings. They were statements, boundaries, symbols, and more practically, they were bottlenecks through which every animal, soldier, merchant, farmer, and dignitary had to pass. And of all Babylon's gates, one name towers above the rest, the Ishtar Gate, a marvel of engineering and aesthetics. This massive blue-glazed structure was decorated with rows of lions, dragons, and bulls, each carefully shaped in relief. The gate wasn't just a passage, it was a procession. It led directly into the heart of the city via the processional way, a road paved in limestone and polished to an almost ceremonial sheen. But while it served ritual, it also handled traffic, daily traffic. Let's start with the basics: entry and exit. The gates opened to the countryside, where farmers brought produce and livestock into the city, and traders returned with goods from across Mesopotamia. Traffic was heaviest early in the morning, and late in the afternoon to natural tides. In the morning, you'd see ox carts approaching slowly from the outer lands. Their wheels traced deep grooves into the well-worn approach roads, which were sometimes raised slightly to prevent seasonal flooding. Alongside them, donkeys bearing baskets, shepherds herding flocks, the occasional traveling musician hoping to earn a few coins within the city walls. Entering the city meant inspection. Some gates had a small booth or covered alcove, where scribes or officials sat tired, perhaps, but alert. They noted what came in. They checked for taxable goods. There were no paper receipts, just impressions in clay, etched with styluses and hardened by the sun. A trader bringing dyed wool would declare his bundles. A farmer offering a basket of figs might pay a small tribute. A priest's cart would glide through untouched, of course. Ritual goods were rarely delayed, but not everything came in peacefully, because the gate also served another purpose: military control. Babylon was a fortified city. Its walls were tall, sometimes more than 30 feet high and wide enough in places for chariots to pass on top. These weren't just symbolic. They were meant to keep people out when needed, and to let soldiers in when necessary. Soldiers, as it happens, had their own traffic. Military carts laden with weapons, rations, or armor were larger, heavier. They were not welcome in the market lanes or temple districts, so they moved along designated roads, often at the edges, hugging the walls, slipping past courtyards with the quiet authority of men who didn't need to ask for passage. During periods of unrest or perceived unrest, guards were posted at gates. Traffic slowed. Inspections became more thorough. People grumbled, but softly. Babylon valued order more than speed. And then there were the ceremonial parades. At designated times of year, especially during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year, the city swelled with ritual movement. Statues of the gods were carried from temple to temple, borne on carts and shoulders, accompanied by priests, musicians, and incense bearers. The gates were decorated. Streets were swept. Dust was suppressed with water. Even the goats, one assumes, were temporarily subdued. The processional way, linking the Ishtar Gate to the great ziggurat and temple complex, became a kind of sacred highway. No market carts here, no casual passers-by. This was movement made holy. And when the festival ended, the city sighed. Slowly, daily traffic returned. Carts resumed their bumping journeys. Vendors reclaimed their corners, and the gate returned to its quieter function, recording, filtering, watching. Let us pause a moment to consider something small but significant: the changing flow of traffic across the day. Babylon had no clocks, but it had rhythms. Morning was inward flow goods, people, food. Midday was stillness, as heat pressed the city into drowsy shadows. Evening was outward farmers returning home, carts creaking as the gates grew wide once more. At night, the gates often closed, or were watched more closely. No large movements occurred after dusk. There were no headlights, no gas lamps. Moving at night was both impractical and, to many, unwise. A city gate at night was a liminal place, neither open nor closed, neither sleeping nor waking. A space of caution. So here we are, standing again beneath a tall archway. The city behind us hums with soft voices. The fields before us stretch wide, lined with irrigation canals, fig trees, and distant hills. A caravan approaches from the horizon, small silhouettes at first, then dust, then shape, then sound, and once again, Babylon prepares to receive. In the next segment, we'll explore how commerce and economy move through the city, not just through streets and gates, but into the homes and hearts of its people. Because traffic wasn't just about direction, it was about survival. But for now, take a breath. Feel the cool shadow beneath the gate. Hear the groan of a cart's wheel turning. Smell the mix of dust and oil and distance. And rest in the knowledge that even the greatest cities are, in the end, simply places where people pass through. In, out, again and again, day after day. Picture a cart, wooden, 2 wheels, pulled by a donkey with a slow, deliberate gait. It creaks just faintly. The axle wobbles slightly, one wheel patched with rope. The driver, a man with cracked hands and a sun-darkened face, rides beside jars of grain, bundles of wool, and 1 or 2 dates that he'll eat before reaching the market. This cart is not a spectacle. It's not even particularly large, but it carries something priceless: circulation. In Babylon, the movement of goods was the heartbeat of the city, and that heartbeat ran not through marble colonnades or grand boulevards, but through narrow, twisting lanes filled with carts just like this one. Let's begin at the outer edge. Goods entered Babylon from every direction. The north brought timber and wine. The south delivered fish and dates. From the east came metal and stone, and from the west textiles, luxury goods, and gossip. These goods were brought in by traders, some traveling hundreds of miles, others from just a few villages away. Not all were rich. Many were part-time farmers in the planting off-season, cousins entrusted with a family's extra grain, young men hoping to trade 2 goats for a better one. Once inside the city, these goods needed distribution. Enter the transporters. Distinct from merchants, these were the quiet laborers who moved things from one place to another. Some owned their own carts and animals. Others hired out their backs, shoulders, or simple sledges dragged by rope. Their job? Deliver. To the temple kitchens, to the royal storehouses, to private homes preparing for a wedding feast, to street-side stalls where a woman sold barley cakes baked that same morning. Babylon, in effect, was a network of small exchanges. There were no supermarkets, no storage lockers. Goods moved constantly fresh, immediate, vulnerable to heat and time. Jars of milk had to be consumed within a day. Bread grew stale before sunset. Fish came salted, dried, or not at all. And so the city pulsed with carts. They weren't fast, but they were many. Some carried bulk grain, so much that the donkeys pulling them panted audibly with the effort. Others transported high-value items, jewelry, dyed cloth, incense hidden beneath common goods, guarded not by armed men, but by anonymity. Then there were temple contracts. Temples didn't just pray. They traded. They owned land, animals, workshops. They received offerings, some of which needed to be redistributed to priests, officials, and the poor. Transporters hired by the temple moved meat, flour, oil. Their carts were often marked with temple seals, simple symbols, etched into clay tags or painted on the side. You can imagine the care these transporters took. One bump too many, and an amphora of oil might crack. A loose knot, and your barley falls into the dust. Failure meant more than shame, it meant loss. And so, they drove slowly, steadily, often choosing longer routes that avoided the market chaos. Babylon also had a class of specialized carriers. These were known, if not formally titled, by reputation. The man with the ox cart who doesn't spill. The boy who runs messages between the silversmiths. The woman with the white mule who brings salt every 3rd day. They weren't famous, but they were known, trusted. In a world without logistics software or tracking numbers, trust was the only insurance. Now, consider the relationship between movement and money. Currency in Babylon wasn't coins. It was weight, usually silver. Payment was often made in fractions of a shekel, sometimes in goods themselves. A delivery of dried fish might cost a portion of what was delivered. A cart driver might be paid in dates, or half a jar of oil. All of this required careful record-keeping. And so, behind every movement, there was almost always a scribe. He sat near the gates, or in temple courtyards, or at the back of the market. He held a clay tablet in one hand, a stylus in the other. Every delivery noted, every exchange recorded. And if a dispute arose, he would refer back, flipping through clay records like one might shuffle pages of a very dry, very dusty book. Sometimes these scribes rode with the cart, especially if the cargo was valuable. Imagine them, perched stiffly beside sacks of grain, sweating quietly, muttering to themselves about unbalanced loads and the recklessness of young drivers. In this way, trade and transport became interwoven. Not just movement, but structure. Carts didn't just deliver goods. They sustained temples, fed families, and supported bureaucracies. A failed delivery wasn't just an inconvenience. It could disrupt a wedding, a sacrifice, or a festival. And through all this, the city adapted. Paths were worn into patterns. Quiet shortcuts emerged. Certain hours were better than others. Transporters knew to avoid the central market just before midday. They knew which gates were busiest at dawn. They knew how to get stuck and how to get unstuck. And so, day after day, Babylon turned. Not by force, by friction. A slow, squeaking, clattering friction made of carts, jars, donkeys, breath, sweat, and expectation. In our next part, we'll look more closely at the places these transporters rested, the inns, courtyards, and roadside shelters where trade paused before beginning again. Because even the most patient ox must eventually stop. But for now, listen. Hear the creak of a cart rolling across packed earth, the faint jingling of a driver's bracelet, the rustle of cloth around bundles tied with rope, and the low, slow whisper of commerce, always in motion. Imagine you've just entered Babylon through the northern gate. It's late in the afternoon. The sun hangs low. The ox pulling your cart snorts quietly, shaking dust from its muzzle. You've been on the road since sunrise. Behind you, a cart of textiles and jars of wine. Ahead of you, the city buzzing, breathing, blinking in the haze of heat and light. You need somewhere to stop. Not permanently. Just for the night. Just long enough to feed your animal, protect your goods, and rest your bones before trade begins at sunrise. Fortunately, Babylon has places for that. Let's begin with the inns, though that word, while convenient, might be misleading. These were not like modern hotels. There was no reception desk, no feather beds, no bar with small, overpriced bowls of nuts. What Babylon had were caravanserai in spirit, if not always in name. A Babylonian inn was usually a walled compound mud brick walls, tall and plain, surrounding an open courtyard. Inside, space for animals, storage for carts and goods, and simple rooms arranged around the edge. Each room had a mat, a lamp, and very little else. Privacy was minimal, comfort Spartan, but safety? That was the draw. The outer wall protected the guests from thieves, weather, and the constant clamor of the streets. The courtyard allowed for conversation, quiet trade, and the kind of weary camaraderie shared by people with sore feet and full carts. Some inns were run by former tradespeople who had spent their youth on the road and now made a living off those who still traveled. Others were owned by temples, offered as service and sanctuary. Still others operated in the legal gray area between lodging and storage facility. Payment was flexible. A coin, perhaps. A jar of dates. A promise to transport something on the way out. Not all debts were paid in silver, many were paid in trust. And here, in these spaces, the rhythms of the city shifted. By day, movement. By night, stories. You can imagine the low hum of voices in the courtyard. A merchant from Ur, talking about temple taxes. A driver from Sipper, complaining about potholes. Someone tuning a stringed instrument tentatively. poorly. Someone else boiling lentils in a corner, the smell mixing with dust and donkey sweat. These inns were more than places to sleep. They were hubs. News spread here of uprisings, floods, marriage proposals. Goods were quietly exchanged. A driver might agree to deliver a bundle of scrolls to a temple scribe. A widow traveling with her nephew might barter cloth for sesame oil. There were no receipts, just nods. And then there were the private courtyards. Not all travelers stayed in public inns. Some wealthy merchants arranged to rest in the courtyard of a fellow trader's home, someone they knew, or someone their uncle knew, or someone their uncle's cousin had once sold fish to during a solar eclipse. These courtyards were smaller, quieter, and came with an added benefit: hospitality. A host might offer water, or food, or conversation. It was customary, especially if your guest had traveled far. Babylonian hospitality was not loud or elaborate, but it was consistent. And then, outside the city, along the approach roads, there were caravan stops. These were more rustic. Simple stone or mud brick shelters, often placed near wells or way stations. No formal staff. Just a roof, a hearth, and a kind of unspoken agreement among travelers. Leave it cleaner than you found it. These stops were used more by long-distance traders, traveling between cities Ishnana, Mari, Uruk. The nights here were darker, the sounds quieter. No temple bells, no city dogs, just the gentle creak of carts cooling in the night and the low conversation of those still awake, staring at stars from behind tired eyes. You might imagine someone stirring the embers of a small fire, preparing lentils with a pinch of salt, telling a story that may or may not be true. And in the morning, everything moved again. The carts were loaded, the animals fed, water skins refilled. A few words exchanged, sometimes prices, sometimes rumors, sometimes jokes older than the walls themselves. And with a slow roll, the city absorbed them once more. These spaces, inns, courtyards, shelters, did not interrupt commerce. They enabled it. They were the buffer zones between movement and rest, between outside and inside, between the known and the unknown. Babylon functioned not only because people moved, but because they had places to pause. And those pauses were sacred in their own way. In the next part, we'll look at the Euphrates Babylon's watery road, flowing through the city like a living artery. Because not all traffic had hooves or wheels. Some came quietly, on boats. But for now, close your eyes. Feel the weight of a long day's journey lift from your shoulders. Listen to the clink of pottery, the shuffle of a sleepy donkey, the quiet laughter in the courtyard. And let the stillness hold you. The Euphrates flowed through Babylon like a slow, steady thought. Not loud, not fast, but constant. It didn't sparkle, at least not in the stories. It shimmered. Silty, warm, wide in places, narrow in others, and lined with reeds that whispered in the wind. To a modern observer, it might seem unremarkable. A river, after all, is just a river. But to the Babylonians, it was nothing less than the city's second street. A quieter street, a deeper one, and in many ways, a more reliable one. Let's begin at the riverbanks. The edges of the Euphrates weren't steep embankments or grand harbors. They were working spaces, sloped mud paths leading down to mooring posts and ramps. Wooden poles driven deep into the earth for tying off boats. Low stone steps. The occasional shaded platform where cargo could be loaded or weighed. You would have seen boats moored in small clusters. Not elegant, not sharp of prow or sleek of hull. These were working boats flat-bottomed, wide, steady. Some were made of wood, yes, but many were of reeds, lashed together and sealed with bitumen to keep out the slow seep of the water. And bitumen was everywhere. A thick, tar-like substance drawn from the earth, smelling faintly of oil and old fires. It was smeared between planks, daubed into seams, painted onto ropes. The scent of it lingered near the docks. Not unpleasant, but persistent. Boats ranged in size. Small reed skiffs, guided by a single pole, were used for short hauls, barrels of fish, sacks of onions. Messages passed from one bank to the other. Larger barges wide enough for 4 or 5 men to stand side by side carried heavier loads. Grain, timber, stone. Some were pulled by hand. Others drifted with the current, steered by oars or poles. And yes, some were towed. You might picture 2 oxen on the riverbank, pulling a rope strung from the shore to a slowly moving barge. Or a line of men, hired for the day, tugging a vessel upstream with slow, rhythmic steps. Their sandals slid through the mud. Their backs bent in the heat, but the boat moved. There were no sails in most river traffic. The Euphrates wasn't consistent enough. The wind was unreliable, and the turns of the river too tight. So motion came from muscle, quiet, persistent, soar in the morning muscle. And what did the boats carry? Everything the city needed. Grain from the farmlands to the south. Timber floated down from the north. Jars of oil, often sealed with clay stoppers and tied with twine. Pottery stacked with straw between layers to avoid breakage. Even livestock, sometimes tethered nervously, blinking against the moving shore. There are records of royal deliveries by boat temple statues, wrapped in cloth and transported during ceremonial processions. These boats were decorated, their sides painted, their prows carved with gentle curves. They moved slowly, and people gathered along the banks to watch them pass. But most boats were ordinary, worn, functional, repaired with mismatched boards, named, occasionally, after gods or relatives. Quietly essential. The river traffic was not chaotic. There were no collisions, no floating traffic jams. Boats moved according to the current. Those going downstream passed quickly, quietly. Those going up took longer, and no one expected them to rush. At the busiest docking points near temples or major warehouses, boatmen waited their turn, sometimes for hours, perhaps for the rest of the day. There were no docks as we might imagine them, with numbered berths or posted schedules. Just patience. And while they waited, they rested, ate salted fish, mended rope, talked softly with fellow travelers, or said nothing at all. Some took naps in the shade of their cargo. Others watched the ripples, thinking about nothing in particular, just the current, and when it might shift in their favor. Tolls and taxes applied here too, of course. Boats entering city-controlled stretches of river were inspected, their cargo recorded by scribes. A portion of the goods might be taken as a kind of dock fee, grain, fish, or a small vessel of oil. No one was particularly happy about this, but it was accepted. After all, the city protected the banks. The city kept the thieves away. The city built the ramps and maintained the mooring posts. Or at least it was supposed to. And if disputes arose, they were handled just as on land. A complaint, a witness, a scribe, a mark on a clay tablet, balance restored. Now, let us not forget ferry boats, small vessels rowed or poled that moved people from one bank to the other. Babylon was split by the river, and while bridges may have existed in some periods, many relied on ferrymen. You'd hail one, step carefully onto the wooden plank, sit on a woven mat, and glide silently across. The trip took only minutes, but it offered a brief pause, a moment of perspective. The city behind you, the water beneath, the other bank ahead, and when the trip ended, you stepped off, paid with a handful of grain or a copper piece, and vanished back into the streets. The ferry drifted away, already returning for the next traveler. In this way, the Euphrates was not just a river. It was a road, a mirror, a slow, shimmering reminder that motion didn't always mean noise, that travel didn't always mean dust. Sometimes traffic was silent. Sometimes it moved with the rhythm of the current. In the next part, we'll return to land tracing, how supply and demand shaped traffic patterns in Babylon, and how the needs of a city created the tides of its movement. But for now, close your eyes. Hear the soft slap of a rope against a wooden hull, the plunk of a pole dipping into water, the distant voice of a ferryman calling across the bank. And drift. Babylon was not a static place. It breathed, slowly, deliberately, each breath shaped by what the city had and what it lacked. Picture a quiet morning. A merchant unwraps a bundle of cloth. His stall is small, just a stretch of reed mat under a simple awning, but his fingers work quickly, folding dyed linens into neat stacks. By midday, 2 of the blues are gone. A woman from the priesthood took them, perhaps for a ritual garment. Now there's a gap. That gap ripples. The merchant sends a message by foot or by boy to his supplier. The supplier prepares another bundle, but to dye the cloth, he needs indigo. And that, in turn, must come from further up the river, which means a boat, a journey, a quiet negotiation with the boatmen, all from 2 bolts of blue. This, then, was the rhythm, slow, recursive, in constant motion. Let's step back and see the larger web. The temples demanded barley, oil, incense, water in clay jars, linen, wine for the gods, and fish for the priests. The markets demanded bread, pottery, wool, salt, and the occasional luxury ivory, cedar, lapis lazuli from far-off lands, wrapped in secrecy and wrapped again in straw. The palace demanded everything: timber for building, copper for tools, bricks, beasts, beakers, bundles of reeds for writing, and baskets to carry the complaints of bureaucrats from one office to another. Each demand created a wave, and every wave created traffic. Take, for example, bakeries. A bakery needed flour brought in sacks by cart. It needed water drawn by workers, poured into jars. It needed fuel bundles of sticks, straw, even dried dung. And of course, it needed salt and sesame, and someone to carry all this through the streets. Each loaf of bread, sold for a few bits of copper, left behind it a trail of footsteps. Quiet deliveries made before dawn, oxen waiting outside kitchen doors, the smell of yeast rising alongside the sound of sandals brushing earth. Or consider construction. A new courtyard being added to a home? Bricks had to be ordered, made, perhaps, at the kill quarter along the southern wall. Fired bricks loaded onto a handcart, pulled by a team of laborers, barefoot, sweaty, muttering to themselves about wall angles and the weight of things. Someone else brought water. Another delivered a stone threshold. The scribe overseeing the contract might pass through twice a week, just to make sure the workers weren't taking liberties with temple time. And all of these quiet errands, wove into the traffic of the city. Now, demand was not constant. It changed. Festival seasons created spikes. Suddenly, the temples needed more oil, more grain, more incense. Priests sent word. Cart drivers worked overtime. The roads near the temple district grew thick with movement. In summer, when the heat pressed down and the water levels fell, traffic shifted to early mornings and late evenings. Fewer carts, slower steps, more pauses in the shade. The city knew how to breathe with the weather. Then came the harvests. In the months when grain was gathered and stored, traffic moved outward from homes to granaries, from granaries to temples, from villages back to the city. It was a logistical ballet, unseen by most, but heard if you listened. The clink of full jars, the groan of cartwheels laden too heavily, the sharp command of a trader reminding a boy not to drop the bundle again. And like any economy, shortages occurred. One year, the dates were thin. Another year, the river ran lower, and fewer boats arrived with fish. Demand surged. Prices whispered upward. The traffic of complaints grew louder than the traffic of carts. The city responded, sometimes slowly, sometimes with cunning. A man from the northern district might offer double the rate for a bundle of onions. The cart driver delivering them might quietly divert his route. The original buyer would notice, complain, and another scribe would be called to resolve what was essentially the Mesopotamian equivalent of a missed delivery window. But most of the time, the system held, not because it was flawless, but because it was known. Repetition bred resilience. A transporter who was late 3 times would not be hired again. A vendor who diluted oil with water found his stall ignored. Slowly, subtly, the city regulated itself. The pace of Babylon's economy wasn't hurried. It wasn't even efficient by modern standards, but it was durable. It moved like a river, not always in a straight line, not always quickly, but always forward, around obstacles, through dry seasons, across generations. And the people of Babylon, dusty, tired, hopeful, walked within it. They didn't need graphs. They didn't need to understand the theory of supply and demand. They lived it. In every jar sold, in every cart unloaded, in every long wait at the gate. So the next time you think of ancient traffic, don't just picture wheels and animals. Picture need, and how every need becomes a journey. Imagine waking in Babylon. The sun has barely broken the horizon, but already the city stirs. You can hear the faint creak of a door, a man's voice, quiet, calling to an animal, the scrape of pottery being moved. You rise, not in a rush. You know what the day will be, more or less. That is the comfort of routine. Babylon, for all its scale and noise, was deeply predictable. And that predictability was not accidental. It was cultivated, reinforced, shaped by rituals sacred and mundane. Let's begin with the temple calendar. The gods, after all, had expectations. The year was punctuated with festivals, some grand, some modest. Each had its own requirements: offerings, processions, ritual washings. These events reshaped the traffic of the city. In the days leading up to a festival, traffic patterns shifted. Carts moved more urgently, but also more carefully. Priests issued instructions. Extra oil was ordered. Markets grew louder, faster, and somehow more orderly. It was understood that the city would swell slightly like lungs inhaling before a long chant. And when the day arrived, crowds gathered, not wildly, not chaotically, but as if called by something internal. Children wore cleaner tunics. Women dusted their doorways. Men queued at temple gates, their offerings wrapped neatly in cloth or carried in modest bowls. Some roads were closed, or rather, quietly avoided. It was bad form to disrupt a ritual procession, even accidentally. So people moved around, taking longer routes, stepping aside as the god passed by carried in a covered litter, eyes hidden, but presence unmistakable. Afterwards, the city exhaled. Like a held breath released, traffic resumed. But not quite the same. Slower, more thoughtful. Until, a day or two later, the old rhythm returned. Then there were the daily rituals, the smaller kind. The kind that kept people in motion, not by law, but by familiarity. The baker began heating his oven before dawn. The smell of bread thick, yeasty, warm wafted through the streets, and served as an unofficial signal. Time to rise. Women visited wells early, before the heat grew heavy. They knew the rhythm of the line. Who would be there first? Who would talk too much? Who might bring a jar too heavy and need help lifting it? Children were sent on errands, always the same paths, always the same stops. The street knew their steps before they did. Priests performed ablutions in sacred courtyards, not in secret, but not for spectacle. Their presence added gravity to the morning reminders that above the noise and barter, something sacred still stirred. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps. not just to clear dust, but to signal readiness. A swept threshold was an invitation, and as the sun climbed, the streets thinned. Everyone knew that midday was a time for stillness. The animals retreated into shade. Workers paused. The heat demanded it. Even the dust seemed to settle. Then, in late afternoon, the city stirred again. Traffic picked up. Deliveries resumed. Markets fluttered with activity. The smell of lentils and crushed garlic rose from courtyard kitchens. People moved, but they moved together. There is comfort in that a shared awareness of when to speak, when to wait, when to walk, and when to yield. Crowds in Babylon didn't surge. They flowed. Even in moments of tension, a missed delivery, a lost coin, a goat who refused to move, there was a soft patience in the air. A sense that nothing was urgent enough to break the rhythm. It is easy to romanticize this, of course. People were still people. There were arguments. There were delays. There were short tempers. But even those outbursts were shaped by context. A man who shouted too loudly might find himself ignored the next time he tried to sell dates. A woman who pushed her way through a procession might be remembered quietly, inconveniently, for a long time. In this way, routine was a kind of unwritten law. It didn't need scribes. It needed memory. And memory, in Babylon, was long. So each day repeated, not identically, but reliably. The streets filled, then emptied. The oxen moved slowly. The scribes recorded quietly. The gods watched from temple heights. And the city flowed around it all predictably, patiently, like the Euphrates itself. In the next part, we'll look at how this shared rhythm created space for public spectacle parades, processions, and the soft architecture of awe. But for now, imagine yourself sitting quietly beside a low wall. You know what comes next. The boy selling onions, the old man with his chipped jar, the priest who passes without ever looking up. You don't need a schedule. You've lived the rhythm long enough to feel it in your bones. Let us begin in silence, not because there is nothing happening, but because something is about to. It's just before dawn, and already a group has begun to gather. They do not push. They do not chatter. They stand at corners, at thresholds, beneath overhanging rooftops, waiting. This is not a festival. Not yet. But it will be. Because today, the statue of Marduk, god of wisdom and storm and order, will be carried through the streets. It is an act not done lightly, or often, but when it happens, it transforms the city not by noise or speed, but by stillness. The processional way Babylon's ceremonial boulevard was not always busy. In fact, for much of the year, it remained unusually quiet, preserved for moments like this. Its bricks were baked harder, its sides decorated with reliefs of lions, guardians of the god, and along its polished surface, traffic moved differently, carefully, reverently. When the statue moved, the people stepped aside. The priests came first, dressed in linen robes, their heads shaved, their movements deliberate. They did not call out, but they did not need to. Their presence, somehow, asked for space, and space was given. Behind them came musicians, not bands in the modern sense, but flutes, lyres, drums, slow rhythms, steady notes. Nothing energetic, nothing to cause frenzy, just a pulse, something between heartbeat and lullaby. Then, the statue itself, seated or standing, depending on the design, carried on a litter by several men priests or appointed bearers, trained to move in perfect synchrony. The litter swayed slightly, but never wobbled. It moved with purpose, but not speed. The god was never rushed. A canopy was held overhead. Incense burned. The air smelled of myrrh, bitumen, and something floral, dried petals, perhaps. The scent trailed behind like memory. And the crowd? Silent, or nearly so. Murmurs, yes. The soft shifting of bodies. The quiet explanation of a mother to a child. That is him. Look, people stood still in windows, watched from rooftops. The statue did not look back, but it didn't have to. Everyone already knew it saw them. After the god passed, movement resumed slowly. Children followed at a distance. Some imitated the priest's steps. A cart turned carefully back onto the road. A dog barked once and lost interest. These processions were not rare, but they were not daily. They marked seasons, victories, renewals. Their power lay in their irregularity. You never knew exactly when the next would come. You just knew that when it did, you would be there. Now, not all spectacles were so solemn. Some were communal celebrations, the closing of a market season, the dedication of a new gate, a royal anniversary. These included more sound, more music, and more bread. Always bread. Streets were decorated with garlands, not flowers, too precious, but reeds, dyed cloth, bits of colored wool. People wore cleaner garments, fresh from the wash. Merchants closed early. Children played without being scolded. At the center of it all, the movement of people. Crowds that knew how to part, how to gather, how to swell and recede like tidewater. There were no security barriers, no ropes, no patrols on horseback. The structure came not from restriction, but from recognition. People knew when to step back, when to step forward, and when to simply watch. There were also royal appearances, rare, carefully orchestrated. The king, in all his regalia gold, lapis lazuli, embroidered robes, passed through the streets, flanked by guards, scribes, and attendants. People bowed or knelt, or simply stood with eyes lowered. His cart, likely chariot-like, rolled with smooth wheels over the better-maintained bricks of ceremonial roots. His presence was a reminder. Babylon was not just clay and trade. It was also power. But even here, the crowd knew its cues. There was no shouting, no cheering, just the kind of quiet that comes when a city remembers its hierarchy and chooses not to question it. And then, of course, there were funerals. Processions of mourning, soft music, wailing, perhaps, but controlled. A body wrapped in cloth, carried on a platform. Family behind. Neighbors in silence. Even in grief, the city walked together. These processions, whether divine, festive, or somber, were not interruptions. They were part of the city's traffic. Babylon knew how to pause, to let movement become ceremony, to let crowds become congregations. And then, once the dust settled, once the drum beats faded, it knew how to return. To carts, to trade, to goats in alleys and scribes muttering at clay tablets. The city never truly stopped. It simply shifted, reordered, like a river parting around a stone, only to reunite downstream. In the next part, we'll follow that current further into the quietest of hours, the night, when Babylon's streets emptied, but the city did not sleep. But for now, imagine the statue passing. Imagine the footsteps behind it, the hush, the low chant, the smell of incense drifting just ahead of you, and your own stillness in the middle of it all. Imagine the sun has set, not fallen, but sunk gently behind the low western horizon. Babylon does not darken all at once. First, the light turns amber, then it deepens into gray. Then, slowly, the blue-black ink of night seeps into every corner of the city. The sounds fade too, not all at once, but gradually. The last cart returns to its courtyard, the wheels thudding against a stone step. A child is called in from the threshold, with a voice soft but firm. A door closes, not slammed, just pushed until it clicks against the frame. The day is done. The streets are empty. Not deserted, not dangerous, just quiet. And what, you might wonder, did Babylon look like at night? There were no streetlights, no glowing windows, no buzzing neon signs to wash the darkness away. What there was, instead, was firelight. Here and there, a small oil lamp burns at a doorway. A flickering wick, casting faint yellow arcs across mud brick walls. In the wealthier districts, courtyards might be lit with 2 or 3 lamps luxury by ancient standards. You can see the shadows of people inside, eating, talking, sometimes just sitting, resting. Lanterns were rare. Torches, rarer, still used more by guards, processions, or emergencies. Most people relied on memory to walk the city's paths after dark. They knew which stone jutted just slightly, which wall leaned inward, which alley collected puddles when the wind blew from the west. In this way, Babylon became a city of the familiar. You didn't walk far after dark, unless you had to. And if you did, you walked slowly, your ears more alert than your eyes. There were guards of a sort, city officials assigned to patrol certain districts. They weren't an overwhelming force, more presence than patrol. They carried staves, not swords. Most of their work involved asking the occasional question, "Where are you headed?" Or, "Do you need help finding your home?" Violence was rare. Not absent, but rare. The city's design did not favor dramatic crime. Its closeness, its narrow lanes, its gossip, its ever-listening neighbors meant that anonymity was difficult to achieve. So the night was, more often than not, a time for stillness. Couples whispered in courtyards. Old men sat in silence, staring at stars. Women braided hair. Children asked quiet questions they hadn't dared to ask during the day. The sky above was large, larger than it felt during daylight, when the city's walls closed in. Now, rooftops became platforms. Babylon was a city of flat roofs. And at night, many climbed up just to breathe. Up there, the air was cooler. The sounds of the city softened into a distant hush. One could lie on their back and trace the constellations. Babylonians were keen astronomers, after all. They watched the skies not just for beauty, but for meaning. A flicker of Mars, the steady path of Venus, the soft belt of stars above the ziggurat's silhouette. And from up there, one could see the whole city quiet, flickering, gently turning in its sleep. The temples, of course, never fully slept. Priests maintained their own cycles. Lamps were tended. Offerings made. The gods, they believed, had their own rhythm, and it was not tied to the sun. A temple after dark was a place of long shadows, echoing chants, and the quiet press of eternity. Even the Euphrates changed. Its sound became more pronounced. In the silence, you could hear its slow passage lapping, slipping, pressing softly against the stone embankments. Occasionally, a boat passed in the dark. Not often, but sometimes. A late arrival. A trader unwilling to wait until morning. A priest returning from an outer district. Their lanterns, faint dots, moved slowly across the water, like stars, like secrets. Stories were told at night, of course. That was tradition. Stories of gods and demons, of old kings and strange beasts, some true, some less so, but always told with a slow voice, half-whispered, as if the darkness was listening too. You can picture it now. A family sitting close in a courtyard, a single lamp flickering beside them, a child leaning forward, mouth open, waiting for the next turn of the tale. And somewhere nearby, a dog shifts in its sleep. A goat coughs once. The city breathes out. Even those who didn't sleep right away, scribes finishing a tablet, bakers preparing early loaves, lovers not yet ready to part, did so quietly. The city respected its own stillness. And in the poorest quarters, where no lamps burned, people lay beneath blankets, their windows open, the night air moving across their skin like a second sheet. Darkness was not feared. It was accepted. It was part of the cycle, a necessary counterweight to the weight of day. And so, Babylon slept, not with the silence of extinction, but with the murmur of rest. Somewhere, a lamp was extinguished. A mother kissed a child's forehead. A priest hummed a final note into the cool night air. And the city simply was. Picture again the streets of Babylon. No lines, no lights, no road signs, no posted rules, and yet movement. Somehow, people made their way. They walked, they stepped aside, they waited, they passed. Slowly, deliberately, sometimes with a grumble, sometimes with a nod, but they moved. It's tempting to think of traffic as a modern problem, as something invented with the car and the rush hour and the red light blinking endlessly at an empty intersection. But traffic is older than wheels. It is simply the movement of people. And where people move, people must negotiate. And that's what Babylon teaches us, not through rules, but through practice, through memory, through the soft repetition of daily life. There was no centralized system dictating the flow, no grand urban control. Instead, there was custom, habit, a kind of polite choreography handed down over generations. And that is remarkable, because Babylon was not a village. It was vast, crowded, vital, full of markets and shrines and gates and gods. And yet it flowed not perfectly, but functionally, gracefully even, in the way rivers do when they've worn down their banks just enough. So what, then, did they understand? Perhaps this: that order doesn't always require command. That movement doesn't always need to be enforced. That when people know a place really know it, they move not just through it, but with it. Babylon moved with itself. Its people didn't rush. They didn't honk. They didn't shout unless they truly had to. They waited for carts. They stepped around puddles. They yielded to priests and parades. They let the statues pass and the gods be carried. And when the street was crowded, they didn't scream. They simply paused, let the dust settle, and moved again. There is a kind of wisdom in that, a quiet trust in cooperation without control, and also perhaps in slowness, because Babylon was slow, not because it had to be, but because it chose to be. A cart that rushed broke its axle. A merchant that hurried forgot the details of the deal. A child who ran blindly might find himself beneath a wheel or lost in an alley with a particularly irritable goat. So the city whispered, "Slow down. Let your feet remember the way. Let your eyes adjust to the dim light. Let your words come only when needed." And isn't there something soothing in that? In knowing that thousands of years ago, people walked without rushing, that they found their way through shared understanding, that even in a city without signs, there were patterns, logic, unspoken agreements that kept people from colliding, even when the paths were narrow. Babylon's traffic wasn't an obstacle. It was a pulse. It carried offerings to temples, grain to ovens, letters between lovers, news from distant cities, children to their grandparents, and the occasional goat, very determined to get somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. And the miracle isn't that it was efficient. The miracle is that it endured for centuries, before maps, before engines, before sidewalks and crosswalks and traffic apps and satellite signals. It endured because people paid attention, because they remembered who walked where, because they yielded without needing to be told, because the rules were not written on stone markers, but etched into daily life. So what can we learn? Maybe this, that sometimes it's okay not to have a sign. That order can come from shared respect. That movement need not be fast to be purposeful. That trust quiet, unwritten trust is the true foundation of any functioning society. And that maybe, just maybe, when we stop trying to control every step, we begin to see the path more clearly. Babylon teaches us not only how people once moved, but how people can move together, gently, without needing to shout. And so, as you drift now, whether into sleep or thought, or simply quiet rest, remember this. You live in a world of lights and alerts and notifications, of lanes and timers and urgency. But once, long ago, a city moved without any of that, because its people understood where they were. and where they were going, and they gave each other just enough space to get there. No signs required. And so, as the dust settles and the lamps grow dim, we leave Babylon behind, not in ruins, but in rhythm. We've followed its streets from dawn to dark. We've stepped around puddles. We've yielded to priests. We've heard the slow wheels of trade and the slow thoughts of rest. And as you drift off tonight, remember there are no carts in your hallway, no goats in your courtyard, no scribes waiting for you to sign a delivery tablet. You live in a world of pillows and plumbing, of light switches and clean feet, of bed sheets and silence on demand. That in itself is a kind of miracle. But should your dreams take you down a narrow lane in a city of mud brick and incense, know this: you'll be welcome there. Just walk slowly. Watch your step, and always yield to the oxen. Good night.